Today, it finally is time to build up the BFA engine. And the first steps with which I will start today are first the preparation of the crankcase. That's fitting the bearings, the oil seals and all the small bits and pieces which belong to the engine case. And second, no less important, the preparation of the gearbox. We will fit and shim the gear cocks. One thing before we start, this really is my own personal engine project. I intend to ride it once it is done. You will therefore see some of my own components go into the engine which are not on the list. That's simply, even though I recommend particular components, I may use something just because I have it already. One example is this lay shaft here. I have a DRT one which is in perfectly good condition and will work just fine. I will use this instead of the Krematz one normally recommended. That does not mean that I do not recommend the Krematz gearbox. What I really recommend is on the list. Only because this is my own engine will I use stuff I already have. Now that I have the gearbox ready on the table, I will prepare everything straight away. I have fitted the cruciform here already. And here is a reinforced gear shaft, in this case a Krematz. I'll start fitting everything. First the loose gears which I have prepared here already. They go onto the main shaft. The most important bit, or something you need to take particular care of, is to shim the gearbox properly. That's the be-all and all for it to work properly, and I will briefly show here how this is done. I'll fit a shim to the one side of the gearbox. The circlip is our next port of call. That's it from the one side, because it was fitted previously already. Now I'll start fitting first the fourth gear cock, then the third, second, and first. If you're not sure which way round the gear cocks need to be fitted, here's some simple advice. You need to make sure the sides of the gear teeth never touch. You should always be able to look through the gap between the gear teeth sides. Can you see that here with the camera? Between the sides of the gear teeth, there always is a small gap. Okay, just to illustrate this, if I, for instance, turn the second gear over, I end up with a large gap here. Now the sides of the gears of first and second gear touch. That second gear just so happens to be a Krematz one. And here you can see, he's gone to some length to make sure you do not mix things up but fit everything correctly. As you can see, it says wheel side here. When I fit the main shaft like this, the wheel is here. So, surprise, surprise, the side that says wheel side is the side that faces the wheel. Idiot-proof, really. Now there is another shim. And then the circlip on the gear selector side. And as you can see, the gearbox is now perfectly shimmed. That's because I have cheated and measured in advance which shims are the correct ones. What you need to make sure, the side play between the gear cocks here, by how much you can cant the gear cocks, should be between 2/10 and 4 of a millimeter, according to Piaggio. I personally like to shoot for the lower side, or possibly a bit tighter still, for race engines. That's not official, it's what I have done with race engines with success in the past though. The best way to test that play is with a feeler gauge, like this. Each of these strips has its thickness or gauge written on them. This one here is 0.1 millimeter. And I'll try to fit it in between the gear cocks here. As you can see, 0.1 millimeter fits nicely and can be moved about relatively easily. As I said, I personally like this to be tight on my engines. Others see that differently because they think that once the engine heats up, the gearbox will expand and everything will be too tight then. That's all perfectly understandable, of course. Thing is though that a newly fitted gearbox is always tighter than it is after running it for 5 miles. As a result, if you ride your scooter around the block twice and then strip the engine, the gearbox will have significantly more play. That's because it is practically impossible according to my opinion, not to have a speck of dust or anything, no particle at all, between the gear cogs. Okay, so now that we are done with that, we'll move on to the engine casing. As you can see, some bearings have been fitted already. Showing the fitting of all would be too boring, I believe. No need to fit all 6 or 5 bearings. In principle, it is always the same, regardless of which crankshaft bearing I demonstrate this on. Okay, I now have to clean this here a bit. And here is the chance for our bearing puller to shine. Maybe you want to film me fitting these bolts here. The tool I have here is of course meant for an original engine, and here the distances are slightly larger. I will try it still to see whether I can make it work. Okay. First, I have to heat up the crankcase. The reason for heating up the casing is very simple. Metal expands when heated. So basically the bearing seat to which we will later fit the bearing will get larger. A bearing seat as a rule is undersized. That means it is a tiny bit smaller in diameter than the ball bearing itself. And if I heat up the aluminium, then the seat gets larger in size, and it's easier to fit the bearing than it would be if I wouldn't have warmed it up. Later, with the crankcase cooled down, the bearing will sit tight and properly centered in its seat. As you can see, it now sits nice and flush. A special feature of the BFA engine case is that the floating bearing sits in the large half of the crankcase. That means the bearing with the rollers sits in the large half. The ball bearing, which is not floating, sits in the small half. With the original engine, it is the other way around. Please keep that in mind when building up an BFA engine. As you can see, I have already fitted the bearings for the main shaft and the swing arm and rear shock rubber bushings. That's the same as with any other engine, so there is no need to go into that really. Next thing is the oil seal. Do make sure everything is nice and clean. One feature of the BFA crankcase is that the stops of the rear brake cable and one of the clutch cable are bolted on. Do keep in mind, 2 threads of the stop of the gear brake cable are through holes into the engine case. Make sure you seal this properly, either with Loctite or some silicone. Now the stop for the clutch cable. This too is held in place by 2 bolts. Better safe than sorry, so do use a drop of Loctite here too, on these bolts too. The good thing about this is, there are engine casings where these threads are stripped, and that's a pain in the neck to fix. It's quite difficult and tedious. With this engine case, it's simple. You only need to undo 2 bolts and fit a new cable stop. Job done. Now, it's the brake drum oil seal. This was more of a fight than it usually is. Here's another little peculiarity. With the BFA engine, the studs for the brake pads are screwed in. They are fitted here already. And the dust cover here is held in place by standard metric bolts and not by these little taping screws. And now, a small break for the obligatory search of one missing part. Question is, where the hell is this O-ring? Underneath this dust cover, as with any standard P-range engine, there are 4 O-rings. One around the bearing, then these double O-rings, to go around the studs, and in the rear where the camshaft passes through. There is another one. Okay, now the dust cover. You may want to use some Loctite on these too, but don't overdo it. Make sure it's seated properly, so that nothing rubs on the brake later. If it does, that sucks. Big time. Now tighten this one, and we are pretty much done on this crankcase half.
Das meiste fertig. Und damit kommen wir
now to the small
zur
half.
kleinen Gehäusehälfte. Hier seht ihr,
here's two more things that are particular to the BFA engine. One is the bushing fitted to the case, a steel bushing, as seat of the countershaft. This too is held in place by 4 bolts.
mit 4 Schrauben verschraubt.
Besides that, the kickstart shaft has a bearing too. It doesn't run in the aluminium as usual, but in a proper needle bearing, or 2 needle bearings actually. They are fitted already, as you can see.
Wie man sieht. Und
the kickstart then is sealed with a real oil seal.
Einen richtigen Wellendichtring. Also,
same story as on the other side. Heat up nicely first.
Warm machen. So,
I'll first fit the bearing by hand.
An.
And now I'll try my luck with this bearing puller. Done like this, the bearing slides home nice and smooth. The bearing now sits nicely flush. Okay, next thing up is the oil seal. It's 2 fitted from the outside here. One for the kickstart. Done and dusted. And the oil seal for the flywheel side bearing. Some cleaning in between.
Immer putzen. Super. Zack. So, das ging so.
Now, this was an easy one. There you go.
Gut. Hätten wir das
That's everything done so far. That's it for today. There are a few other small things on the casing, but not many really. I will, for instance, complete the brake actuation before closing the engine and fitting the studs and other bits and pieces, which we will deal with next time. See you!
Tschüss!